Megan had always wanted the full college experience, and living in the dorms seemed like the perfect way to make friends and enjoy her freedom. She was assigned a single room in an old dormitory building on the edge of campus. At first, everything seemed normal until she started feeling like she wasn't alone. Megan's first few weeks of college were exciting. The dormitory she'd been assigned to was one of the older buildings on campus, with creaky wooden floors and thick stone walls that made it feel more like an old manor than a dorm. It had charm, but also an eerie, isolated atmosphere, especially at night. Her room was on the top floor, tucked into a quiet corner of the building. She loved having a single room to herself, a luxury compared to many of her friends who shared their space with roommates. It was mid-September when things started feeling off. At first, it was small things, barely noticeable. Her belongings would be slightly out of place, or she'd hear the faintest of sounds in the night, like soft footsteps, but whenever she looked, no one was there. She brushed it off as her imagination. After all, the building was old, and old buildings creaked and groaned, right? One night, while she was studying late, Megan felt a sudden chill in the air. She wrapped herself in a blanket, but the temperature in the room kept dropping. She checked the window and realized it's closed. The heater is on. But the cold remained, an almost biting cold that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She shook it off and got ready for bed, but the unease lingered. That night, she woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something faint, almost imperceptible. Whispers. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The whispers were so low she couldn't make out the words, but they were there, just beyond the walls. Megan pressed her ear against the cold wall. It was faint, but unmistakable now, like two people murmuring just out of earshot. Her blood ran cold. She knew the room next to hers was empty. She had seen it during move-in week. The next morning, she asked her RA about the room. "No one's assigned to that room this semester," the RA confirmed. "It's been vacant for a while." Megan's heart sank. She didn't want to seem paranoid, but the whispers, the cold, something didn't feel right. Over the next few days, she tried to ignore it, but the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. Her lights would flicker at odd hours, and she would often wake up to the sensation of someone standing at the foot of her bed, only to find the room empty. One night, things escalated. Megan was studying late again, her desk lamp casting a dim glow over her notes. It was quiet outside, almost too quiet. She felt the air grow cold again, a familiar sensation by now. But this time, the cold was accompanied by something else, a feeling of being watched. Megan glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. As she turned back to her desk, she saw it, out of the corner of her eye, a faint movement in the reflection of her laptop screen. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head, dread creeping up her spine. In the shadowy corner of her room, there was a figure, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, with indistinct features, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. Megan froze, too terrified to move. The figure stood still, watching her. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Megan bolted out of her room, running down the hall to the RA's office, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't explain what she had seen, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone in that room. Jake was a history major, and like many students, he spent long hours in the library. He often ventured into the basement archives to do research for his papers. The basement was old, poorly lit, and rarely used by anyone else. One evening, while working late, he realized that he wasn't as alone as he thought. Jake loved the quiet of the library, especially the basement level where the old archives were kept. It was the perfect place to get some serious studying done. The basement was a dim, claustrophobic space filled with rows of old books, documents, and microfilm machines. Few students ever ventured down there, and the isolation helped Jake focus. He was working on a major paper, digging through old newspaper archives from the early 1900s. The basement was cold, and the fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows between the towering shelves of old books. But Jake was used to the odd creaks and groans of the building. It was an old library, after all. On this particular evening, Jake was the only one down there as usual. He had his headphones in, listening to soft music while he worked. About an hour into his research, something odd happened. The music in his headphones cut out, replaced by a faint static. He pulled out his phone, assuming there was a problem with his connection, but his phone was fine. The music returned a moment later, and Jake shrugged it off. A few minutes later, he heard something. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sounded like a soft knock coming from behind one of the rows of shelves. Jake paused, removing his headphones. The basement was silent, save for the distant hum of the air conditioning. He listened for a moment longer, but the sound didn't return, so he went back to his work. But then the knocking came again, louder this time. Jake stood up, his heart racing. He walked toward the shelves where the sound had come from, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. The lights flickered above him, and a chill ran down his spine as he reached the end of the row. There was nothing there, just more shelves, more books, and the thick, musty air of the basement. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just the building settling or the pipes. But as he walked back to his desk, the knocking resumed. This time, it was faster, more urgent. Jake's stomach twisted with unease. He turned around, scanning the basement, but there was no one in sight. He gathered his things quickly, deciding to finish his research upstairs in the main library. As he hurried toward the exit, the lights flickered again, plunging the basement into darkness for a split second. When the lights came back on, Jake froze. At the far end of the basement, standing between the rows of shelves, was a figure. It was tall, its features hidden by the shadows, but it was unmistakably there, just standing, motionless, watching him. Jake's heart raced as he backed away, his eyes never leaving the figure. He turned and bolted up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he reached the main library, the warmth and light of the upper floors felt like a lifeline. For the rest of the semester, Jake avoided the basement archives, opting to work in the crowded, noisy main floor. He never told anyone what he had seen that night, but the memory of the figure in the basement haunted him. Every time he passed the stairwell leading down to the archives, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, waiting. Claire thought she had lucked out when she was assigned a dorm room with only one other girl. But as the semester progressed, she noticed that her roommate Laura acted strangely. She never seemed to leave the room. And then one day, Laura simply stopped responding. Claire had heard horror stories about terrible roommates, so she was relieved when she met Laura. She seemed quiet, maybe a bit shy, but she was polite and didn't seem like the party type. They weren't best friends, but they got along fine, and for the first few weeks, everything was normal. But as time went on, Claire started to notice that Laura rarely left the room. She'd come back from class and find Laura sitting on her bed, staring at her phone or reading a book. At first, Claire assumed she was just introverted, maybe homesick. But it started getting weirder. Laura didn't eat with Claire or the other students in the cafeteria. She never went to the library, never seemed to hang out with friends. Every time Claire returned to their dorm, Laura was there, sitting on the bed, always in the same spot, barely acknowledging her presence. One evening, Claire decided to go out with some friends. She invited Laura, but Laura declined, mumbling something about not feeling well. When Claire got back late that night, Laura was still sitting on the bed in the exact same position, staring at the wall. "Laura?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. Laura didn't respond. Claire felt a wave of unease. Something about Laura's stillness, the way she sat so rigidly, made Claire's skin crawl. Over the next few days, Laura's behavior became even stranger. She stopped speaking altogether. Claire would come and go, but Laura never left the room. She just sat there, always in the same spot, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Claire couldn't take it anymore. She went to their RA expressing concern about Laura's well-being. The RA promised to check in, but when Claire returned to the room later that evening, Laura was gone. Her side of the room was empty, completely cleared out, as if she had never been there. Claire stared in disbelief at the vacant bed. There had been no sign of Laura moving out, no explanation, no goodbye. The next day, Claire asked around, but no one had seen Laura leave. The RA claimed she had been reassigned to another dorm, but no one seemed to know where. And that night, as Claire lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that Laura wasn't really gone. The room felt colder, more oppressive, as if the very walls held onto the presence of her silent, unnerving roommate. Clary never saw Laura again, but the empty bed across. From hers always felt occupied, as though someone or something was still watching her, waiting for the right moment to return. Thanks for watching the video. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you loved the twists and turns, don't forget to hit the like button and share the stories with your friends. Make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling tale, because there's always a new mystery or adventure just around the corner. Until next time, keep imagining, keep exploring, and remember, nothing is ever quite what it seems.